Hello and welcome to the special live coverage of the 2021 End Persecution of Falun Gong in Washington, D.C. rally. I'm David Zhang. Falun Gong, or Falun Dafa, is an ancient spiritual practice. It comprises moral teachings, a meditation, and 4 gentle exercises. Since its inception in 1992, Falun Gong has an estimated 100 million practitioners worldwide. Unfortunately, on July 20th, 1999, the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, began a violent campaign to persecute Falun Gong practitioners in China. Millions of innocent people there have been fired from their jobs, expelled from school, jailed, tortured, or killed simply for practicing their faith. For the tens of millions of practitioners living in China today, each day they live at risk of being taken away by Chinese authorities to be jailed, tortured, or worse. Today, representatives of Falun Gong gather in Washington, D.C. to rally against the persecution that is still happening in China to this day. Here to talk about what we're seeing today and the implications for both the United States and China is the Executive Director of Falun Dafa Information Center, Mr. Levi Brody. Hello, Mr. Levi.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me.
Great. And we also have the privilege to welcome a Falun Dafa practitioner here at the studio to tell us her personal experience. Hello, Hanyi.
Hello, David.
Great to have you here. Also, live on the ground from the National Mall in D.C. is our D.C. correspondent, Melina Weisskopf. Melina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Prison for their faith alone. Falun Gong practitioners
We're here in Washington, D.C., right on the lawn of the National Mall, right in front of the Capitol, where a group of thousands of spiritual practitioners have gathered to commemorate the 22nd anniversary of the persecution of Falun Gong in China. Now, this group of practitioners is around, an organizer told me there's around 1,500 practitioners from all around the United States who have come here to rally. They're really trying to raise awareness and let the American people know, as well as U.S. lawmakers, that they should condemn the persecution of this spiritual practice. Now, some of the people that you see out here have been blackmailed, have been received death threats by the Chinese Communist Party for speaking out against this persecution. Now, in a couple of minutes, we will hear from some human rights activists, some speakers. They'll speak about why they think it's urgent for people to see clearly the evilness of this persecution. You see behind me, they're holding these signs. Some of them say things like, reject the Chinese Communist Party, save the practitioners of Falun Gong. Some signs say things like, the world needs truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. So in just a little bit, they're going to walk these signs right down Constitution Avenue and walk all the way to the National Mall, David.
Our cause remains the
Thank you, Melina. And once again, we'll be hearing back from her very soon again. Now, just before the rally starts, Levi, could you give us a little bit of the details as to what are the practitioners gathering here for today?
Well, really, you have practitioners coming from all across America, and today is the anniversary when the persecution first started back in July of 1999. That year, it was a very immediate and urgent issue, and we all descended on Washington, D.C., knocking on doors of congressmen, trying to tell them what was going on in China. But in subsequent years, we've organized these rallies and organized these speeches. Sometimes congressmen appear, human rights advocates appear. And really the point is to tell the American people and to tell the American government exactly what's happening to Falun Gong and why it matters for both the practitioners of Falun Gong in China, but really for America as well.
Great. We'll be once again hearing back from Levi, but now we will return to the background, to the ground, and where the rally will be beginning.
International religious freedom, or USERF, to participate. Our chair, Nadine Maenza, planned to be here, but unfortunately another pressing matters preventing her from joining you today. My name is Kurt Worthmuller, and I am a supervisory policy analyst at USERF. I am honored to be here in her stead. USERF recognizes that Falun Gong practitioners face serious challenges globally, including even in Russia, where just this week a regional court in Siberia upheld an unjust ban on the community as part of a widespread crackdown on many religious groups that the Russian government considers non-traditional. However, we must turn our attention today where, even as the Chinese Communist Party and President Xi Jinping celebrated the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CCP this month, we remember the many atrocities that this brutal communist regime has committed since it came to power in 1949. 72 long years later, unfortunately, religious freedom and human rights conditions in China have rapidly deteriorated under Mr. Xi's rule, contrary to the wishful thinking of many who had initially hoped that he would be a reformer, bringing great change to China. In fact, religious believers in China, including Falun Gong practitioners, are experiencing what may represent the worst era of religious persecution since the end of the infamous Cultural Revolution, which stretched from 1966 to 1976. And we know that the intense persecution against the Falun Gong community in particular has lasted 22 very long years. In USERF's most recent 2021 annual report, we highlighted the continued official harassment, detention, imprisonment, and torture of Falun Gong practitioners in China in 2020. United Nations human rights experts and credible international reports have also expressed grave concerns that Chinese authorities have continued the horrific and abhorrent practice of forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners, but also of Uyghurs and other Muslims, Tibetans, and house church Christians. To be clear, there is no place in the 21st century for forced organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners, mass internment of millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps, or widespread demolition of religious and cultural sites. At this 100th anniversary of its founding, the CCP must instead come to terms with its reprehensible history of persecuting religious believers, and it must end these egregious policies once and for all. It must unconditionally release prisoners of conscience who have been unjustly detained or imprisoned for the peaceful practice of their faith. And until or unless the government of China finally moves to act in a responsible manner as such, the United States and its like-minded partners around the world must do their part to meaningfully hold the CCP accountable for these atrocities. In fact, since our very first annual report 21 years ago, USERF has consistently recommended that the State Department designate China as a country of particular concern, and we have urged the U.S. government to take consequential actions to hold the Chinese government accountable. We continue to urge the U.S. government to pursue a multilateral approach, working together with international partners to expose the CCP's abuses and to impose targeted sanctions against Chinese officials and entities responsible for religious freedom violations. We also specifically urge the U.S. government to implement a diplomatic boycott against the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. On behalf of USERF, I want to thank you again for your courage and tireless advocacy in defending religious freedom in China. USERF will continue to work together with you in the Falun Gong and our many civil society partners as we look forward together to a day when all Chinese believers of all faiths and all traditions can worship freely, safely, and in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Werthmuller. Our next speaker is Ambassador Andrew Bremberg. He's President and CEO of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you gathered here today. Today is an important day, and your presence here is a powerful witness in the face of oppression. The systematic targeting of people of faith is a feature of the Chinese Communist Party. And sadly, the Falun Gong movement has been a central and tragic story at the centerpiece of the CCP's abuse and persecution. Founded as a peaceful spiritual movement, it has now been forced to carry on its practice underground, hiding from the long arm of the Chinese Communist Party. As the government attacks the most sacred right to religious freedom, it is vital for all peoples everywhere to denounce these unjust acts. In July of 1999, recognizing the power that the movement instilled in its practitioners, the Chinese government banned it from China. Those who continued to exert their religious rights were arrested and sent to labor camps. Many who were sent to these camps were tortured and killed. Thousands of Falun Gong practitioners remain in detention in China today and continue to be subjected to torture. To ensure that Falun Gong was not to be practiced by future generations, schools were forced to indoctrinate students, calling the Falun Gong a heretical cult. And it's so important to see young people here today. One of the Chinese Communist Party's most grotesque tools of oppression is the practice of forced organ harvesting. Today, Falun Gong practitioners and other religious and ethnic minorities in China are victims of this horrific human rights abuse. The CCP has claimed that these organs come from voluntary donors, but the mounting evidence proves otherwise. Just last year, our research from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation provided new primary evidence and data analysis that exposed the falsification of official data sets demonstrating that China's forced organ harvesting was occurring. And last year, importantly, the China Tribunal, an independent international people's tribunal, concluded, quote, unanimously and sure beyond reasonable doubt that in China, forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience has been practiced for a substantial period of time involving a very substantial number of victims. The tribunal importantly explicitly names Falun Gong, stating forced organ harvesting has been committed for years throughout China on a significant scale, and that Falun Gong practitioners have been one and probably the main source of organ supply. Horrifying. Last month, UN human rights officials and special rapporteurs called on China to promptly respond to the allegations of organ harvesting and to allow independent monitoring by international human rights mechanisms. Sadly, we know that the Chinese Communist Party will not heed these calls for justice. And it is important that all of us, including the U.S. government, lead in the international community to demand that China live up to its international human rights obligations. Fortunately, right now, Congress is considering important legislation that can help prevent further acts of forced organ harvesting. The Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act expands the U.S. government's powers to directly combat organ harvesting by imposing harsher penalties for purchasing organs, imposing sanctions on individuals and government officials in countries who support human organ trafficking and forced organ harvesting, and introducing mandatory reporting on human organ trafficking in foreign countries and on U.S. institutions that train organ transplant surgeons. The Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation is urging that we hold the Chinese Communist Party and other foreign governments responsible for their complicity in these heinous human rights abuses accountable. We will continue to raise our voice against China's abuses and demand human rights and justice for all the victims of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly the practitioners of Falun Gong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Bremberg. Our next speaker will be Faith Mcdonald, Director of Advocacy at the Catartismos Global Incorporated.
Good morning. As was said, my name is Faith McDonald, and I feel like I am a veteran of coming to your rallies. Every time I come, I'm encouraged by you. I'm blessed by you. I especially love this banner that says, "The world needs truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance," especially truthfulness. Truth is in low supply today, and I thank you that you provide truth, you provide integrity, and you provide one thing I don't see on the banners, but I know you have, is courage, because it takes courage to speak the truth. And in these days, after 22 years of what Falun Gong has been through in China, and by China's tentacles reaching out into the world as well, you have continued to stand for truth. And we're at a point now where, thanks be to God, you stand for truth against the lies that are taking place in the West as well. So I thank you for that. And I thank you that you are spreading truth in America. You know, the only newspaper that I read, and probably all the Westerners who speak to you here now say that, is the Epoch Times. That's the only one I can get truth through. And only one I can hear about how good my country, the United States, is. The only one who talks about America's greatness. We're in a point now where communism is using useful idiots in America to bring down America. And we need America to stay strong in order to be able to support you, in order to be able to support all of the vulnerable people around the world. So I thank you. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And you have to know that I will always stand with you until this evil is at an end. And that I love you, and that I pray for you. I pray for redemption and deliverance and freedom for everyone in China, for my Christian brothers and sisters, for the Uyghur, for the Hong Kongers, but especially for Falun Gong, because of the truthfulness that you continue to shine. And I thank you. That is a gift from God, to shine truthfulness. You are blessed to have that. And I would like to end just by saying, you know, communism, I read the 9 commentaries, by the way. And one year when I was giving my speech here, I said, yeah, people read the 9 commentaries and 3 million people have renounced communism. And it was actually 300 million people. So I praise God that people are learning the truth and leaving communism. But, you know, communism says that there is no God. They say that they're trying to, as this banner says, their ultimate goal is to destroy humanity, to destroy the human race. And they do that, they're lying when they say there is no God. They mean that they are God. That's what they mean. They want to take the place of God, and they're not going to do it. No, they may think they are, but they are not going to do it. The way you can tell the difference between communism trying to be a god to people and the true God I'm going to close with is a blessing from the Bible. It's the Aaronic Blessing. And you can't, that blessing doesn't work with communism because it says, the Lord bless you and keep you. Communism curses you, and it keeps you in prison. It keeps you in torture. But God wants to keep you in the palm of his hand. It says, the Lord make his face to shine upon you. Communism will never shine. In fact, when we shine a light upon it, it has to scurry away like rats or cockroaches. The Lord lift his countenance upon you, and that means the very essence of God wants to be with you, whereas communism is deceitful and lying. It is not God. And it ends with, and grant you his peace. We'll never have peace with communism because the poor, deluded communists, they know no peace themselves. They're like an animal that's being eaten from the inside out. But God grants his peace. So the Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McDonald. Our next speaker is a victim of the persecution. Her name is Chen Yun.
Hi everyone, my name is Falun Chen. My English name is Grace, and I'm in 10th grade. I come from Changsha, Hunan, China. I come to New York to study in August 2020 in order to be closer to my dream, to become a professional erhu performer. Every time I play the erhu, I am enjoying and found it difficulty to stop. The erhu is an important part to my life. I live with a family friend in New York. My parents are still in China. They introduced the erhu to me and encouraged me to practice hard. Although we are separate, they care about my life here very much. If we had our way, we would continue with our frequent telephone calls. But on October 27, 2020, the phone calls stopped, and I never be able to contact them again. On this day, my parents and the 5 other Falun Gong practitioners were abducted from a previous home by 1 policeman and about 20 plainclothes thugs. That evening, they were formally arrested at the Changsha detention center. But I only know about this because of a report on Minghui website. Such a horrible thing to imagine. Had I still been in China with my parents, it is likely that I would have been abducted along with them. I also practice Falun Gong. I would likely have been with my parents studying our teachings with others at that previous recess. The last time I spoke to them was on Monday. To think that the reason for them not calling me on Tuesday was that they had been arrested. To think that the arrest was happening just as I was starting my 9:30 morning class. To think that as I played erhu on Wednesday and Thursday, they were in a cold conquer cell. And to think that they have been there for these long 9 months. Nearly every day since then, I look at the Minghui website and check my phone messages, hoping for news of their release or at least something about their whereabouts. In June, they may have been sentenced to prison. Recently, There is more news on the Minhui website about practitioners in human preference being arrested or harassed. Although it's been 9 months since my life was turned upside down, it still feels very new. I'm not used to it. I often don't know what to think or even how to feel about it all. Scared, angry, sad, lonely, lost. I will fit all of this and more. I'm often at a loss for words. I would certainly hate those police officers and thugs if I didn't practice Dafa. How would I possibly forget them with the things they have done to my parents and me? But today, I see silver lining. I'm encouraged by so many people here. I'm encouraged by the voice of justice from government officials. I'm encouraged by the hope for justice and freedom that America stands for. All of this remind me that, most of all, I am encouraged by my parents' full faith in truth, compassion, and tolerance. Thank you everyone here for standing by and listening to my story and helping my parents and so many families like me. Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is Rong Yi, president of the Tuidang Center.
Greetings, everyone. The Tuidang movement, Quit the CCP, is the largest grassroots movement that encourages Chinese citizens inside and outside China to renounce the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese Communists, Young Pioneers, and Youth League. Today, more than 380 million brave Chinese have made the right choice and renounced CCP. CCP is an evil spirit. It's not a normal party or regime. Its history is full of killing and blood. As we can see, suppression of all religion and political distance, forced organ harvesting, genocide of Falun Gong practitioners, Uyghurs, Tibetans, crackdown on Tiananmen students, endless political movements that killed 80 million innocent Chinese lives. CCP has destroyed Hong Kong. It has severely destructed 5,000 years of Chinese splendid history, culture, and tradition. The regime's initial handling of the pandemic and the cover-up of the virus origin have resulted in heavy global disaster and huge loss of lives. CCP is a global threat. Its ambition is to control the whole world and destroy the humankind. Now the world is at its critical moment. We must stand up against the evilest regime on earth to eliminate the CCP, for it's closely related to our future. The Tuidang movement offers the best solution to peacefully dissolve the CCP. It has brought about spiritual awakening, may also bring about peaceful transformation, political or institutional change inside China. Since June last year, the Global Service Center for Quitting the Chinese Communist Party has initiated a petition campaign to eliminate the evil Chinese Communist Party. This petition, just in 1 year, we have got over 1 million supportive signatures at the endccp.com. I would like to take this opportunity to call for an end to the CCP's 22 years of brutal persecution of Falun Gong practitioners in China. Call for an end to suppression to all Chinese, including Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibetan, and Uyghurs. Call for release of all prisoners of conscience in mainland China and in Hong Kong. Call for a more and stronger support from the international community to support the Tweedang movement, to support Chinese people's struggling for freedom. We must unite and work together and work hard to eliminate the evil red dragon, the CCP. A world without the CCP will bring about real peace, freedom, security, and prosperity to everyone on earth. Thank you very much.
Next, I would like to introduce the Friends of Falun Gong Human Rights Award. Every year since 2018, Friends of Falun Gong has honored an individual or organization for their contributions towards supporting Falun Gong practitioners' freedom of belief on a local, national, or international scale. The honorees are people who have contributed their time, talent, and effort to raise awareness of the persecution, and done so on a scale so as to create ripple effects throughout their fields, opening new possibilities for advocacy. This year, we are pleased to announce that the winner of the Friends of Falun Gong Human Rights Award is Dr. Zev Ozzowski. Dr. Ozzowski is an Australian of Polish descent. Having experienced the persecution of Polish communists against him and his family, Dr. Ozzowski now dedicates part of his time to countering the CCP's persecution of Falun Gong. Dr. Ozzowski wears many hats. He was the Australian Human Rights Commissioner and Disability Discrimination Commissioner from 2000 to 2005, and since 2006 has been the President of the Australian Council for Human Rights Education. He has the unique distinction of serving as the President of the Australian chapter of the World Organization to investigate the persecution of Falun Gong. As such, he has worked closely with Falun Gong practitioners in Australia. Through his unique perspective as a Polish refugee, he has incisively and powerfully advocated for freedom and justice for the Chinese people. We are gratified that such a true friend and powerhouse has accepted this year's award. As Dr. Ozzowski could not be with us on such short notice, Mr. Simon Vereshchak will accept the award on his behalf. Mr. Vereshchak, like Dr. Ozzowski, is an Australian whose family had first-hand experience of communism.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am honored to accept this award on behalf of Dr. Ozzowski. Though he cannot make it here today, he sends his deep thanks and a promise that Falun Gong practitioners will be able to practice freely again. He dedicates his award to those in Australia working to advance the human rights of Falun Gong practitioners in China. My grandfather was persecuted terribly by communism in Ukraine, unlawfully jailed, tortured, and not allowed to have freedom of thought or belief. I deeply respect Dr. Ozzowski for his selfless efforts to help Falun Gong practitioners in China. He is not a Falun Gong practitioner, but out of his own will and decency, he raises awareness of the horrendous persecution of Falun Gong by the Chinese Communist Party, letting the world know the truth of these crimes. I hope that more kind-hearted people like Dr. Ozzowski will help end the persecution so that Falun Gong practitioners can freely practice their belief in China again. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Nina Shea, Senior Fellow and Director at the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute.
Hello, thank you. It's such an honor to be standing in solidarity once again with the Falun Gong community. This year we had the U.S. government officially designate the Uyghur Muslim community as victims of Chinese government genocide. It's time that the United States recognize what is happening, the genocide occurring against practitioners of Falun Gong in China. Genocide is the destruction in part of a religious community, for example, with the intent to eradicate it. And I don't think there's any doubt that what has happened these past decades to Falun Gong meets that criteria. This is the most heinous human rights crime. It's engraved in the American heart that we will never again tolerate this. Falun Gong practitioners have been subject to prison, to torture, to black jails, and to and for about 15 years we have heard reports of massive organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners. These stories have circulated. The Chinese government has always cast doubt on them, denied them, been deceptive, covered up. But now it's absolutely irrefutable. Many experts have come forward with impressive studies. And on June 14th this year, an extraordinary statement was issued by the UN giving insight into the terrible fate of some of the detainees in prisons and black jails. 12 leading UN human rights experts cited credible reports that China harvested body organs from detained religious minorities, and none so more than Falun Gong practitioners. These are the UN-founded punishments targeting specific ethnic, linguistic, or religious minorities. And according to these reports, after blood samples and ultrasound checks, surgeons excise detainee believers' hearts, kidneys, livers, and corneas. So this is essentially surgical execution without any due process for China's live organ transplant business. This is affecting Falun Gong most expansively, but also is targeting Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, and Christians, according to the UN. In an extensive early study from Canadian former Cabinet Minister David Kilgour and other experts, David Mattis and Ethan Gutman, they unequivocally concluded several years earlier that the sources for most of the massive volume of organs for transplants is the killing of innocents, including Falun Gong practitioners. And China's energetic cover-up, among other things, the PRC officials helped to establish the Anti-Organ Trafficking Task Force of the World Health Organization and manipulates it, causes such reports to be dismissed as controversial, as Matthew Robertson of the Victims of Communist Memorial Foundation documented last year. It's an abomination that the exhibit Real Bodies, featuring vivisected Chinese cadavers, is now showing in Las Vegas, even though it was canceled in Switzerland in 2018 after actions by Christian Against Torture demonstrated that the remains were likely those of extrajudicially executed Falun Gong detainees. This must stop. There must be legislation that bans this exhibit and bans tourist transplants to China. Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be with you.
Our next speaker is the Honorable Eugene Braun.
Hello to all friends of human rights, to all friends of freedom of expression and religion everywhere in the world. I'm a member of the German Parliament, the German Bundestag, and my opinion is that the Communist Party of China is a threat for the whole movement of human rights in the world. And every victim of the Communist Party of China deserves our totally support, and I wish you the very best for a better development for human rights in China. The Chinese people haven't the right to decide for more than 7 decades. And we are on your side, thinking about more freedom in China. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Wendy Wright, President of Christian Freedom International.
I want to thank you for being here and being here every year, persistently with endurance. You really are an example for others of how to stand up for those who are being persecuted. Christian Freedom International helps persecuted Christians around the world. And the first time that I learned of the abuse of the Falun Gong by the CCP was in around 2006 as I walked through Lafayette Park, and the posters were displayed of the victims of CCP's violence for simply believing. And it was so horrifying that I did not want to believe it. But I know how communists operate, and those pictures rang true. I knew that this, in fact, was the truth. And so since then, I had advocated with the White House and State Department to penalize those who are accomplices with the medical tourism and organ harvesting. So I'm so grateful for the work that's been done on that. But now I think we also need to pay attention to those who are benefiting from the organ harvesting, those who take advantage of the medical tourism to go to China to get an organ that's been harvested from an innocent victim of China's abuses. Corporations now are paying attention to their supply chains. Pressure has been put on them that they need to prove that their products have not been produced by slaves. Well, the same thing needs to occur with medical tourism. The beneficiaries, those who are traveling to China in order to get an illegal organ that's been harvested by a victim, the burden needs to be on them to investigate, to prove what the source of that organ. And that should hopefully dry up the medical tourism going to China. There should be penalties upon those who are buying these organs. As a Christian, we are called to pray for those who are persecuted. So we partner with you in the suffering that the Falun Gong are enduring, because we know the same is occurring to Christians in China. And so we pray for those who are suffering for their belief. We pray that the Lord would come and visit them, would rescue them, would be their refuge. We stand with you and advocate on your behalf, not only with the U.S. government and other governments, but to God Almighty, that He, who has all power, will intervene and rescue and save those who are being persecuted for their beliefs. Thank you.
Our next speaker is the Director of Advocacy for Freedom House, Annie Boyajian.
Good morning. It's an honor to join all of you, especially it's such a hot day and you have been standing here for so long already. Thank you for your commitment to standing up for all of those who are persecuted in China. I wish that I didn't have to join you today, but it is our honor to be with you. It is no secret to anyone gathered here or anyone watching that President Xi Jinping has intensified repression in China with a brutal crackdown against not only Falun Gong practitioners and other religious believers, but also lawyers, political dissidents, labor leaders, grassroots activists, and even regular everyday internet users who happen to say something that runs afoul of CCP's approved talking points. The situation has unfortunately not improved for Falun Gong practitioners over the last year. Freedom House data has shown the regime's campaign to eradicate the Falun Gong spiritual practice has continued unabated over the last year. Hundreds of Falun Gong practitioners have received long-term prison sentences, and many others are arbitrarily detained in various legal education facilities. Detainees typically face abuse and torture aimed at forcing them to abandon their beliefs, sometimes resulting in deaths in custody. Many of the officials leading the campaign of atrocities against the Uyghurs moved up in the ranks of the CCP after first trying some of their brutal techniques against Falun Gong practitioners, Tibetans, and others. The CCP has also obliterated rights in Hong Kong in violation of law and its own international commitments and treaties, and is intensifying a crackdown against all dissent in Hong Kong. Not only has repression worsened within China's own borders, Xi Jinping is also leading an aggressive effort to extend the CCP's repression beyond its own borders. China conducts the most sophisticated, global, and comprehensive campaign of transnational repression in the world, surveilling, threatening, and even physically attacking dissidents who have been forced to flee China. We commend the US government for working with the UK, Canada, and the EU to impose coordinated sanctions against CCP officials involved in violating human rights, including some who were involved in the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. We also applaud today's sanctions on officials responsible for the deterioration of rights in Hong Kong, and we urge additional coordinated sanctions against perpetrators of abuses against Falun Gong practitioners and other religious believers. Freedom House stands in solidarity today with Falun Gong practitioners and all those persecuted by the CCP. We thank you for your bravery, and we look forward to the day when all in China are able to freely exercise their fundamental rights, including the right to freedom of religion and belief.
Our next speaker is the Executive Director for Save the Persecuted Christians, Dee Lagerson.
Hello, Falun Gong. I'm glad to be here with you once again. I stood here on this stage with you in 2019. And of course, none of us was able to be here in 2020 because China exported the coronavirus to the rest of the world. China is a transnational criminal organization, and the Falun Gong have been courageous in their persevering testimony to the atrocities being committed by the Chinese Communist Party. Save the Persecuted Christians, of which I am the executive director, and the Committee on the Present Danger, China, for which I serve as the executive secretary, stands with you today. But we first and foremost want to thank each and every one of you. It's your family members, it's your fathers, your mothers, your aunts, uncles, daughters, sons, an entire community that has been sorely oppressed, disgustingly so. You first began to tell the world of your sorrows in the early part of this millennium. In the year 2000, China's transplant numbers went way up. Where are they getting
these organs. In 2006, China admitted that they were getting organs from prisoners of conscience sentenced to death. But those prisoners of conscience were ill after harsh treatment in these Chinese prisons. These organs were being advertised as healthy. So something else was up. And what the China Tribunal found in 2019 was that China's organ tourism industry is criminal. We cannot stand for this any longer. China is committing genocide against its own people. The Falun Gong, Tibetans, Southern Mongolians, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, they are all coming under the malign domination of a tyrannical regime. But you have been the heroic witnesses standing here and telling your stories, no matter the threats from the wolf warriors who seek to intimidate you and shut you up. But you will not be silent, and we will not be silent either. The captive nations of the Committee on the Present Dangers, China, stands with you, a united voice. I am a mother from Colorado, the middle of these great United States. I'm not a foreign policy expert. I don't belong to a think tank. I'm just a motivated American mom, and I stand with each one of you today. And as a Christian, you are always in my prayers. Thank you so much for being here today. Next year, I pray we don't have to come again, because the CCP will be no more.
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. Wang from the World Organization to Investigate the Persecution of Falun Gong.
女士们、先生们，大家好。1999年7月20日，以原中共党魁江泽民为首的中共犯罪集团，操控整个国家机器，对上亿的法轮功学员实行了群体灭绝性的迫害，特别是大规模的活摘法轮功学员器官的罪行，是人类历史上从没有过的邪恶，是对人类道德底线的毁灭，是中共主导的国家犯罪、反人类罪。追查过去，经过10多年的持续的、系统的、全面的调查，我们已经完成了对中共大审判前的证据准备。
Welcome back. Now we're just onto a Chinese speaker, so we'll take this moment to summarize some of the speakers that we've heard from so far. Now we've heard from multiple speakers who've outlined many of the atrocities being committed against not only just Falun Gong practitioners mainly, but also, as some have said, Uyghurs and also Christians in China. Of course, they're a call to action to end the persecution in China. Now, Levi, could we get your opinion on some of these speakers? So first we had our Ambassador Andrew Bremberg, who basically says, you know, a lot of these persecutions are happening in China, and what has Congress been able to do so far for us?
Well, Congress over the years has issued 5 resolutions solely on the Falun Gong issue, talking not only about the injustice of what's happening to Falun Gong and how good it's been for China, that the practice has been for China, but really condemning China in the harshest of terms. And there's been 5 resolutions of that so far. I think the key thing that was mentioned today is that there is a bill before this Congress that would take very serious and decisive action to curtail the forced organ harvesting in China. And I think that needs to be the #1 priority of this Congress. Yeah.
Right. So another speaker says, there's been sanctions that's been applied in particular to Falun Gong practitioners in China, and I believe one of them was from the past administration, the Trump administration. The other one was quite recent, actually. I believe it was in May. Could we get sort of a sense as to what did those sanctions actually do to help out these Falun Gong practitioners?
That's a great question, because on the surface the sanctions might seem a little light. What they essentially do is that person and that person's immediate family cannot travel to the US, and some of them might have financial repercussions. What's very interesting about these sanctions is they target very specific people. And the Minghui website, which runs a vast network, we're talking millions of people inside China that distribute information that counter the state-run media there, they're able to actually distribute news from the US. And so what we saw when those sanctions happened, both last year and when Secretary Blinken announced it in May, is that it had 2 effects. One, we actually saw Falun Gong detainees being released early, and the police were kind of scared because they didn't want to be on a sanction list. And then you had a lot of police or officials that were trying to cover their tracks. They're trying to disconnect themselves with agencies that are related to the persecution. And that really stays the hand of would-be persecutors. So it has really a tremendous effect inside China.
Oh, that's really good to hear, because according to Minghui.com's data, which is a website that collects and is for a Falun Gong practitioner platform, it collects all sorts of news directly from China related to the persecution of Falun Gong. Now, I was just going to read you some of the data according to Minghui.org. Over the first 5 months of 2020, 599 Falun Gong practitioners have been documented to have been sentenced for their faith. One of them is 81 years old, and she received 9 years in prison. And more than 15,000 practitioners were documented to have experienced harassment for arrest last year. Now, based on we know sanctions have been quite effective against certain key officials. Do you think that Congress should have more of these targeted towards individuals, or is this can be something that can be targeted towards? For example, in Hong Kong, we've seen that a lot of the officials in Hong Kong have actually been sanctioned for what they've done during 2019 until now with the national security law. Could this something also work in your experience with those that persecute Falun Gong practitioners?
Absolutely. I think when our State Department issues these sanctions, the 2 sanctions that they did issue were actually fairly low-level officials. However, it still had that kind of effect. Now imagine if they sanctioned officials that were in provinces where the persecution of Falun Gong is far more severe, such as the northeastern provinces or around Beijing, or if they sanctioned higher-level officials. I mean, the magnitude of that effect would be 2, 3, maybe many times more than what we saw with these officials. So this is a very effective tool. A lot of Chinese officials are trying to maintain assets or escape routes out of China because many of them see the collapse of the Communist Party coming. And so this kind of sanction does generate a lot of fear among officials, and they work, and we should do more of them.
Right. So super interesting, because I think one of the multiple speakers actually, they've mentioned how the Uyghur Muslim population in China and out of China has been able to get what seems like more actions or more direct policies towards helping them. What do you think is the biggest factor that maybe has been preventing some of the policies towards directly for Falun Gong practitioners? Well,
that's a really good point. I mean, I think Nina Shea outlined this from the Hudson Institute just now. Why is there not a genocide designation on Falun Gong? I think it comes down to 2 main things. One is that the Chinese Communist Party has been very effective, unfortunately, in spreading a lot of propaganda about Falun Gong, and that really dampens enthusiasm to stand up for the practice and to advocate for them. And that's had a very, very big impact. But I also think it speaks to how much Falun Gong is, at least in the minds or the eyes of the CCP, is a threat. Because Falun Gong, back in the 90s, Falun Gong was everywhere, 100 million people in all stages of, all sectors of society. And so it really represents the single biggest threat in the minds of the CCP for disclosing the crimes of the CCP, not just to Falun Gong, but to all the Chinese people and really the world. So I think that's been a key factor in the CCP trying to suppress, far more than any other group, any news reporting on Falun Gong.
Right. Okay, we'll definitely be hearing more about all of the issues at hand. And now we will return to Melina Weisskopf, who is our DC correspondent, for her to conclude us with the rally today.
So we're here at the rally in D.C. with a couple of practitioners who have faced this persecution head-on in China. So right here we have Chi Li-hua, whose husband and her were arrested in 2001. Then her daughter Cindy. So their story, a little bit about their story. Her and her husband were arrested in 2001 together. She was in and out of prison while she was pregnant with Cindy, and then her husband was released in 2009, and he died in the hospital 13 days after his arrest because of all the torture he faced while he was in the Chinese jail. He was, as you can see from these pictures, he was starved, he was struck with electric sticks. So he faced all kinds of brutal persecution. So I wanted to ask you, Chi Li-hua, how did you feel in 2001 when you and your husband were arrested for practicing Falun Dafa?
在2001年，您的丈夫和您被抓捕，因为修炼法轮功被抓捕。
And she only speaks Chinese, so we will have a translator.
我当时觉得我没有做错，就是因为信仰真善忍应该是正确的，人就应该有道德那个规范，应该按照真善忍去做好人，这没有错。
I felt like I had done nothing wrong because it is right to practice truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. Humans need to have a moral standard, and so it's right for me to practice that.
So she felt like she had done nothing wrong by practicing the spiritual discipline. Now, I wanted to ask a little bit about why were you not scared? Because this persecution has gone on for 22 years. This month will mark the 22nd anniversary. So I just want to know, why weren't you scared? How come the CCP didn't scare you away from practicing this?
为什么您没有因为这场中共政府的迫害而感到害怕？为什么您依然坚持修炼？
我其实也是挺恐惧的，因为这个过程当中我也被 抓捕过4次，但是我觉得，既然我坚持了这里，我就应该坚持下去哈，坚持按真善忍去做一个真正的好人。
She said, I was actually also scared because I was actually arrested 4 times, but I felt like I should persist because it's important to persist in believing in truthfulness, compassion, forbearance.
Okay, and I wanted to kind of bring up a little bit. So they face something very brutal. This young girl right here, Cindy, she didn't even get the chance to meet with her father because she was born when the year that her father was jailed. Is that right, Cindy?
Yeah. When I was in my mom's stomach, my father and my mom, they released together. So I just saw my father like twice. Yeah.
So she saw her father just twice in her life because when he was released, she was already 7 years old, right? You were 7?
Yeah, when I was first time saw my father, I was 7 years. That time I was scared to hug my father, so it's for like regret in my life. Yeah.
You were scared to hug him because you were afraid of his body so fragile. Is that why?
That time his mental is good, but because he is like a stranger to me, so that's why. But yeah.
That's horrible. And her life was actually uprooted. She was telling me that, so these two moved here about 4 years ago. They're in asylum here in the United States. And she was telling me, Cindy was telling me that she had bounced from school to school growing up. She never really had a solid, stable life in China because they were fleeing the persecution pretty much the whole time that they lived in China. So I wanted to ask you, Shirley Hua, I want to ask, what is your message to the American people and U.S. lawmakers who are maybe not informed about what's going on? What's your message to them?
您想要对美国民众还有美国的立法机构，他们可能不知道这一场迫害，您想为他们传达什么信息？
我想对美国政府和那个美国人民，就是想告诉他们，这场迫害是真实存在的，特别就是残酷哈，好多人都被迫害致死了，很多家庭也妻离子散，特别是很多的那个法轮功学员被活摘器官。这个罪恶是不能继续下去的。我希望就是美国政府和美国人民哈，帮助中国这些法轮功学员立即停止这场迫害。
She wants to tell the American government and people that the persecution is actually really happening, that it is very cruel, and many families have been torn apart, and people are even suffering live organ harvesting. And she wants the American people and government to help the Falun Gong practitioners to stop this persecution immediately.
Do you have hope for the future? What brings you hope? Do you have hope that this will stop? What are your thoughts about the future?
您对于未来的这种是什么样的展望？您觉得这个迫害会很快停止吗？
我觉得必须结束，肯定是会结束，因为正义，总会战胜邪恶的。我想这个罪恶不会太长的，不会。
So she says this will stop. She believes it must stop, and it will. And that's because good will always triumph over evil. And so that's it.
Okay, Cindy, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts about the future? She's 19 years old, by the way. Cindy is. So she's still in school right now. What are you doing on a daily basis? You know, do you feel like it's a blessing to be able to tell? I mean, it's a horrible story. It's horrible that what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. But how do you handle this? What are your thoughts about, you know?
Actually, I always tell my story to my friend, my classmate, my teacher, and they said these are terrible. I always want to share my story because the persecution in China still continues. So tell everybody to stop it because each person know a little bit and they will know the truth from China because a lot of people don't know. And I want them help to tell everybody, help us stop the persecution.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for being here today. So that's exactly what they're going to do today. They're going to be parading down the streets of Washington, D.C., just getting the word out there because many people have faced similar situations to her husband, and it is such a heartbreaking story. So in a couple of minutes, the group of people will be raising awareness by parading down the street.
Thank you again, Melina, and also to all of the victims of this persecution. We've been discussing with regards to what Congress can really do to help with stopping the persecution, or what kind of events that they should really be participating in terms of that. Now, Levi, we were just discussing that one of the speakers, whose name is Anne Boyandian, who is the director of advocacy for the Freedom House, she mentioned many things that were very important. One of them was actually how the Communist Party of China has been able to export whatever persecution methods, whatever ideas that they've used for the persecution of Falun Gong toward other countries. Could you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was really taken by her speech, actually, because she made 2 points on that, which are really important for people to understand. And that is, first of all, what's happening inside the country. When the CCP persecuted Falun Gong, they really did refine the mechanisms of persecution, literally taking people from labor camp to train them on ways to torture people so someone gives up their faith. So they developed these mechanisms, refined them, and now we see those exact mechanisms are now being used on Uyghurs and other groups. So the persecution has really been an incubator for horrific tactics that many other groups are now suffering from. But she also mentioned a really key phrase, and that is transnational repression. And this is key because what she said is very right, is that the Chinese Communist Party way above anybody else, exports their persecution to pretty much every country around the world. We had a diplomat that defected from China, and he disclosed that every single Chinese mission around the world, the diplomatic missions, have significant resources dedicated to repressing Falun Gong in the local country. And you see everything from interference with our government leaders to our businesses to outright thuggery. We've had people just beaten up in the streets of America and other parts of the world. We had someone shot out in South Africa. So a lot of this repression on Falun Gong, they're really taking it global. And I think that was a really important point that she made.
Great. Now, I'm wondering, the question is, these people are parading today, they're rallying today. Do you, in your information you've gathered, do you see that they're still being harassed, or are they being tracked, or any sort of, has the Communist Party of China been able to extend their arm of the persecution, even as these people escape from China?
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of these people in the parades today, anybody who has family or any kind of ties to China is under constant pressure. I've heard story after story after story of if they have somebody take a picture of a rally, or some agent here from the CCP takes a picture and lets them know that, oh, you're participating in Falun Gong activity, the family back in China is harassed. They could be fired from their job. They themselves can be taken away from the police. So a lot of these folks are quite heroic by standing up, even though they're in the United States, because they're constantly, all their family and their friends back home are constantly under pressure because of what they do.
Great. So now we've actually recently got to speak with a congressman. His name is Scott Perry. Our correspondent Steve Lance got a chance to ask him how to deal with this issue at hand of practitioners constantly being harassed, or what just Congress can do to really recommend the solution, or even to enact those solutions to help bring those to fruition. So we'll play that video for you now.
And is there anything Congress can help to do to protect freedom of religion and stop these types of crimes against humanity?
Well, the world needs to know a lot, and Congress can do a lot. So let's start with what the world needs to know. The world needs to know that there are many Chinese people, the vast majority of them, that are yearning to breathe free and are under the boot of the Communist Chinese Party, which is a totalitarian criminal organization. The Falun Gong practitioners it's a spiritual practice which involves exercise and is absolutely completely harmless. However, tens of thousands have been oppressed, many tortured. We've heard reports of forced organ harvesting, forced live organ harvesting, which is as horrific as you can imagine that it would be. And these are the things that, just think about this all day long, while shoe manufacturers, while the National Basketball Association, while different organizations are doing business with the Communist Chinese Party, these are the actions that the Communist Chinese Party are taking. And so the world needs to be made aware of this, whether it's the essentially concentration camps in the Western Xinjiang province with the Uyghurs, whether it's the cultural removal of Tibetans, that culture being removed systematically by the Communist Party. The Falun Gong falls right into this circumstance where they are oppressed, they are tortured, they are tormented, and they are sought to be obliterated by the Communist Party. Now, once the world knows that, then you say, well, what can we do? Certainly, we can all take individual actions by speaking out about these things and informing neighbors, friends, colleagues, business associates, so on and so forth. What Congress can do is proclaim that this is occurring and shed light on it. I think that's really important to acknowledge, to officially acknowledge that these things are occurring. And then there have to be consequences to it, whether that's sanctions, whether that's a reciprocity circumstance where we don't allow, say, Chinese students or Chinese trade at some level based on a requirement to change these activities, these actions. So I think that both the administration itself and Congress has a great role to play. And a lot can be done, and there's no time to waste. Every single day goes by are more people being tortured and more emboldening the Communist Party to just continue to do the things that it has done in the past without any accountability. As long as they feel like they can get away with it, they're going to continue to get away with it. And so at a minimum, at a minimum, we need to be calling it out and standing in solidarity with the practitioners and supporters of the Falun Gong and other people, Hong Kongers, people in China that just want to be free.
Levi, do you have any reaction to what Congressman Scott Perry said?
Well, I think one of the things he mentioned is sounded very simple, but I think it could be very powerful, and that is just stating that this has happened at the congressional level and very publicly. The Chinese Communist Party thrives on their propaganda getting out and silencing voices of dissent, and part of the reason, not the only reason, part of the reason they thrive on that is it sort of gives them legitimacy back home. So when the United States Congress is standing up and saying very clearly what this persecution is and that it should stop, it really has a restraining effect on the CCP leaders. So aside from the acts that he's talking about, the Forced Organ Harvesting Act that we talked about, clearly we need to take those actions. But having clear messages coming up from our Congress can do a lot of good.
Great. So during our next segment here with Levi, we will get to understand the scope of the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners in China. But before that, speaking of information, Levi, could you give us an introduction to what Falun Dafa Information Center does?
Sure. We're a nonprofit organization based in New York, and really it started just a few days after the persecution started. No one knew what Falun Gong was. No reporters knew where to call to find out information. And so we quickly formed a group out of New York City that was just trying to get firsthand information that was just coming out bits and pieces out of China. And we have since grown that operation to try and do that not only in the United States but around the world. And the primary function is to document the human rights abuses that are happening in China and get those into the hands of the Freedom Houses or the United States Congress that can do something about it.
Great. And so, of course, one of the very major topic of discussion today was on the issue of forced organ harvesting. And that is something that has been coming out with news and evidence since as early as 2006. We're fortunate here today in the studio to welcome one of the Falun Gong practitioners who's personally lived through this experience. Her father was persecuted to death in early 2000s, and so she's joining us today. Hello, Hanyu again.
Hello.
Hanyu, could you give us sort of understanding or a background as to what happened during with your father?
Sure. Well, after the persecution started in 1999, my father was detained and sent to the labor camps for several times, suffering torture during the incarceration. He was last arrested on February 28, 2004, and was persecuted to death on May 4, 2004, in the Fangshan District Detention Center. We were not allowed to see my father's body at that time because the police claimed that an autopsy was needed because the cause of death was unclear.
And when were you allowed to actually see his body?
On June 18, 2004, and more than a month after my father's death, the police allowed our family to see the remains. On the day we went to see the remains, the Fangshan Police Branch dispatched a lot of police cars and personnel to closely monitor the site. We were not allowed to bring cameras, nor allowed to invite reporters.
And can you tell us or describe to us what you saw there?
There were stitches at the throat area using very thick black threads. The incision extended down until covered by the clothes. I stepped closer and wanted to unbutton the clothes and examine the wound. Then I was able to open up 2 buttons, and the policeman on site immediately stopped me and forced my family out of the facility.
So there were other people there with you that day?
Yes, then my other relatives, including my uncle, went in. They tore up my father's clothes when the policeman was unprepared. They found that the incision was all the way from the throat to the abdomen. When they pressed his abdomen, they found that his abdomen was stuffed with hard ice.
And how did you find out about what had happened to your father, or when did you find out about it?
I didn't know what happened to my father at the time in 2004. Until one night in the summer of 2007, when I was browsing the internet, one news popped out on the Chinese chat program, revealing all kinds of crimes related to live organ harvesting. I was trembling in my whole body after I read the report. I could hardly believe the things as evil as that could happen. Then I thought about my father's death and the damage on his body, which clearly indicated my father's organ could be harvested while he was still alive. I could not imagine what he had suffered before he died. I cried all night long until I passed out.
Wow. And so this has been happening in China since early 2000. And Levi, could we get a brief take from you on forced organ harvesting? And we've got another video for you here.
Sure. I mean, it's basically the practice of taking detainees, prisoners of conscience, largely Falun Gong practitioners, pre-testing them, and then people can come from all over the world and essentially order an organ. The Falun Gong practitioner is taken into the operating room, their organs are taken, that practitioner is killed, and the person paying for the operation gets their organs. There's now an overwhelming amount of evidence that this has been happening at significant scale since the early 2000s.
Wow. And now we have one of our programs from China in Focus actually did a story on a practitioner's father who was also persecuted, and here we have the video for it.
Zhao Fenghui disappeared in southern China's Sanya City in Hainan province on Wednesday. He practices Falun Gong, a spiritual meditation system that has been brutally persecuted in China since 1999. The man's son, Zhao Shuai, explained his father had started heading home in the afternoon. But by that evening, he still hadn't arrived. No one could reach him. A family friend then called the police and confirmed that one person had been arrested and detained that day. But officers wouldn't release the person's name. Shuai suspected it was his father. That same evening, a group of police officers went to Shuai's parents' home. They ordered his mother to open the door, but didn't mention his father's whereabouts.
The police came to my parents' door and kept harassing us. My mother stayed quiet inside. She didn't dare to open the door because there were too many police officers. The camera on the door captured 6 people.
Shuai's father worked as a project supervisor for a major Chinese bank. He was expelled from his work unit and sent to work in a forced labor camp twice because of his belief. All 3 members of the family practice Falun Gong.
Since the persecution of Falun Gong started in 1999, my father has been petitioning authorities. He's been detained several times for a total of nearly 5 years. My father went on hunger strike 3 times, each time for more than 20 days. He went on a hunger strike, then was arrested, and then went on a hunger strike again.
Shuai's father was first arrested in 2000 for holding protesting banners in Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Authorities then transferred him to the detention center in his hometown in northeastern China. There, police instructed other inmates to beat him and tied his feet to a 3-foot-long stick. The stick was left on for a full week, even while eating and sleeping. Once it was removed, he could no longer walk. The man was later sent to a forced labor camp, an effort to force him to give up Falun Gong. The police beat him until he lost consciousness. He and other Falun Gong practitioners were also forced to watch videos slandering Falun Gong. That's in addition to performing forced labor. In 2002, Shuai's father was detained in a labor camp for the 2nd time. He went on a hunger strike while there. Because of it, he went from over 200 pounds to just 90. By the time he was released, he couldn't even walk by himself. In light of the persecution, the family was forced to move to southern China in 2005. But the police continued chasing them from the northeast to the south. Last year, Shui finally settled in Europe. According to U.S.-based Falun Gong news website Minhui.org, in the past year alone, over 100 Falun Gong practitioners have died because of the persecution. Shui continues to appeal to the international community, asking the world to pay attention to what's happening to his family and rescue his father.
I just want them to release my father immediately and stop harassing my mother. At the same time, I also condemn this torture used by the Chinese Communist Party against us Falun Dafa practitioners.
Shui's mother has since escaped and fled her home, but there's no information about Shui's father's whereabouts. Changchun, NTD News.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us now, this is the live coverage of the 2021 rally to end persecution of Falun Gong in Washington, D.C. Now we have Melina Weisskopf once again from D.C. standing by with her interview.
So we're here. This group is getting ready to start their parade march down Constitution Avenue all the way to the National Mall. This is thousands of people who practice this spiritual discipline. There's a good variety of things going on here. We have these group of people who are holding the signs of victims who have been persecuted, tortured to death by the CCP. So you have that group. You also have a different groups holding different signs. This one says the world needs to return to truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. You have people holding signs about just clarifying the truth about the persecution, letting people, raising awareness to Americans here about what's going on, because sadly, many people are still unaware of this brutal persecution, even though it's 22 years long this has been going on. So they'll walk down holding these signs, playing music. There's also a marching band they have just a little ways up. You may see it in just a little bit. They have a whole marching band to just draw some attention. A very peaceful, vibrant environment here in DC right now, David.
All right, so we are now in the process of starting the parade, and once again, they will be marching down Constitution Avenue toward 15th Street, which is where the parade will end. Right now, we're seeing the Tianguo marching band. All original pieces are being played. So we're hearing the drums play, and soon we'll be hearing from the horns. And so all the pieces that's been played, or that will be played, are originally scored, but they also play some traditional American pieces, for example, the national anthem. So let's take this time to actually talk about the three core tenets of Falun Dafa, or Falun Gong, is their truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Can you give us sort of an introduction to those? How has that been sort of the values driven the group so far?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because a lot of people still in the West are a little bit unfamiliar with Falun Gong, and it's important to remember that Falun Gong is a traditional Buddhist-based practice that, as you mentioned, it involves sitting meditation, slow-moving exercises, but study of moral principles that are all centered around those three principles: truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. And I think you really see that resonate through the group. It's really sort of, they take it to heart, they live their lives according to those principles the best they can, and you even see it in really horrific circumstances where inside China, telling a lie might actually get them out of prison or avoid some very difficult situations, and they still don't do it. And that principled stance is not only, I think, a real strength for countering the persecution in a peaceful way, it's really won the admiration of many Chinese advocates, such as lawyers, Christian lawyers and other types of lawyers in China, that see Falun Gong really embodying the very best of traditional Chinese culture. And I think that gives people a lot of encouragement.
And there's many questions I want to go from here, but I guess the first one is, in the beginning, who were the people that practiced? Was it social elites? Were they students? Were they very what kind of individuals were comprised of this Falun Gong practice?
Well, that's a good question, because like many of these questions, the answer has been twisted a lot by the CCP. I think the CCP would like you to believe it's just a bunch of superstitious old ladies. The fact is, Falun Gong, as we mentioned in the beginning of the program, there were 70 to 100 million people, and it was everywhere. It was farmers and housewives, it was business professionals, it was high-ranking government leaders at the very highest level, it was military. I mean, Falun Gong, you could not separate Falun Gong with all of Chinese society. It was in every single province and every single town across China.
And so with Falun Gong, what was the transformation, or I guess every practice of sort has almost an effect on that person, right? What do you think was the effect that Falun Gong provided these people that, even despite people are getting killed or getting sent to jail, that they're still able to maintain this faith of theirs?
I think there were two main things. What you saw in the very beginning when Falun Gong was first introduced to the public in '92 and for a few years there, people were just experiencing tremendous health benefits. Everything from, minor ailments just disappearing to really horrific diseases and very difficult health problems was just disappearing. And a lot of people were experiencing this, and that's what they were telling their friends and their family, and that's what really made Falun Gong grow very widely in those first few years. But then there's a second component, and that is after people started reading the principles and understanding what Falun Gong was really about, they said, this is the true great things of ancient China coming back. And you keep in mind, this is a people that have been suppressed by an atheist communist regime for 60, 70 years. So it was so refreshing to have something authentically Chinese at a time in China when very little was, come out and be a spiritual practice that they can embrace. So it was both the health benefits and its traditional Chinese values that really made it resonated with the Chinese people.
Now that's interesting because you mentioned 100 million practitioners worldwide. So besides China, the United States is a Western culture, Western civilization. What do you think that it also attracted not just Chinese people, but everybody around the world to this practice?
Well, it's interesting to see the growth of Falun Gong in the United States because it actually started with all these Chinese students who had come over from China in all the Ivy League schools, basically. So you had sort of the very best of the Chinese students come over to America to study in our top universities, and they brought Falun Gong with them, or they were taught by their parents. So it kind of started there on college campuses in America. But I think from there, it really just grew very much like it did in China, because although on the surface it's traditional Chinese culture, but really truthfulness, compassion, tolerance, these are very universal values. And I think it really resonates with people. Having really good health resonates with everybody, and these kind of values resonate with everybody.
That's really interesting. And so, of course, given the persecution that started in 1999, do you think, what was the Communist Party's goal of trying to stop these people from practicing? Was it just so that they don't practice the exercises, or do you think there's something behind the persecution itself?
The truth is, it was a tragic political grab by the very head of the Chinese Communist Party at that time. Now, yes, by the end of the 1990s, the government had taken a survey and found out there were 70 to 100 million people. That's more than the numbers of Communist Party members. So some of the leaders are going to get very nervous about that. Yes, Falun Gong is a spiritual faith and embraces traditional values in a communist atheist country. So that ideological thing made some of the leaders nervous. But that wasn't enough to cause such a horrific persecution. It was really Zhang Ziman, who was the first leader of China that had very little credibility. He had not gone through the revolution. He was desperate to build up sort of a cult of personality, like Mao and other leaders had done. And along comes Falun Gong, and it's all anyone is talking about. And so finally, at the middle of 1999, he was the one who ordered this group must be eliminated. And he ordered that it be done in 3 months. And there was a tremendous power struggle, because again, a lot of people, including top leaders, knew Falun Gong, they knew it to be good. This is crazy. There was a tremendous power struggle, and eventually Zhang Ziman, this CCP leader, prevailed. And he was the one that said, we must eliminate this.
But it's interesting, it seems Falun Gong did not get eliminated. It's now spreading in the Western world as well. And you mentioned earlier, we were going to go to this, was that the effects of peaceful protest or peaceful dissident in China, and that's something that Falun Gong's been doing, right?
You have, and I mean, and I think one of the speakers talked about it here. They mentioned two things. They mentioned truth and courage. And I think you saw it in the interview there with Shirley and her daughter, Cindy. I mean, imagine that. Your husband's just been tortured to death. What did that do? Did Shirley and eventually Cindy just sort of hide away? They've stood up and they've been a voice for the voiceless for over a decade now. Multiply that by 100 million. That's what you see happening in China. It's that in doing this, they've taken a very peaceful but a very sort of courageous and principled people, and they've created a grassroots civil disobedience movement that is exposing not just the persecution of Falun Gong, but is now exposing all the crimes that the CCP has been involved in since it took power in 1949.
That's very interesting. And so far what you're seeing are different banners being paraded that says Falun Dafa is great. Now, it's interesting because each year, as we've covered, of course, last year, given the pandemic, we weren't able to hold these rallies. But this year, of course, given the size, there's many practitioners who I assume right now is getting close to 100 degrees out there in the DC weather. But we see that there are people holding, they're wheeling their child in the cart, and people have their hats, but I assume the sun is getting quite heated out there. And so this one here, it says Falun Gong has spread over to 100 plus countries around the world, and it also says that Falun Gong has great benefits. And so basically, could we get from the persecution since 1999, has there been a change as to how the persecution evolved from, I assume back in 1999, the technology or the information to persecute was different than now that, as some of the speakers have mentioned, seems the regime change also ramped up the persecution, if not completely, basically got fully blown over.
Well, I mean, I think when this first happened, I mean, literally on July 20th of 1999, people were pulled from their beds in the middle of the night, taken to detention centers in just the first week or two alone. I mean, tens of thousands. There were so many Falun Gong practitioners being detained, they had to detain them in stadiums. And that's been going on for years and years and years. The wrongful just beating down of doors and taking people away in the middle of their dinner and throwing them into a labor camp or a black jail, that's been consistent throughout. There are two changes that you touched upon or differences that we've seen evolve. One is technology. People don't remember, perhaps back in 1999, a lot of us had dial-up modems. I mean, the internet was just coming into its own in terms of a high-speed ability. The Great Firewall, or what is known as the Great Firewall, was first built to block information about Falun Gong and to surveil Falun Gong practitioners. It is now obviously grown, and it does much more than that and really constrains all of China. But it was really engineered initially on Falun Gong. So the technology that they've used to go after Falun Gong, sadly with the help of some Western companies, has been unfortunately very effective. The persecution, in terms of the last few years, what we're seeing, particularly the last 18 months, the persecution has escalated in terms of number of people who've been detained and sentenced and things like that. And that's really because Falun Gong is no longer, in the eyes of the CCP, just a group they're persecuting for their faith. It's also a group that is exposing the CCP's crimes. So for example, when the pandemic hit and the CCP was covering things up and telling the world lies, it was the network of Falun Gong people in China that were taking pictures of different neighborhoods in Beijing or Wuhan and showing the world, actually, this is what's happening. What you're being told by the CCP is a lie. So the CCP is actually clamping down on Falun Gong, not just because of their faith, but because they have the courage to expose the CCP on the world stage.
And it seems there needs to be a lot of courage to stand up against the Communist Party of China. As we've seen on the world stage, they've only grown more aggressive, as the speakers have mentioned, under President Xi Jinping. And so now marching towards us are more banners that says the world needs the truth and the world needs Falun Gong. And this is interesting because Falun Gong is actually sort of a great American achievement story. You know, you have the values of religious liberty that's been written in the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. A lot of those values are, you know, what the founding fathers of America actually championed, and they cherish the idea that people are able to practice faith freely in this country. Can you expand a bit on that?
I said, that's a really good point. And I think when I often tell people Falun Gong is a great American story, and they kind of look at me in disbelief. But if you look at it, they are a mirror in many ways of the Puritans and many of the people who came here. Horrific religious persecution in their homeland. They came here with nothing. I mean, we're talking about predominantly first-generation Chinese. A lot of them, again, were students. They had no money. They have no resources, they have no cultural connections, and yet over the 20 years, not only have they been able to set up a base here so they can freely practice their faith and enjoy the liberty of America, I think they've become a champion of American ideals and freedom more broadly because they came to us, and I'm now speaking as an American, they came to our shores at a time when the threat of the CCP was the most ominous. Right. And they're the ones who've been sounding the alarm about the danger we all need to wake up to that the CCP poses.
Right, definitely. Now we're also seeing there's endless from my screen here of Falun Gong practitioners just marching down Constitution Avenue. Now on Constitution Avenue, we're going to be ending at 15th Street, and that is where the DC Memorial, the Washington Monument is. And right across from the DC Monument, of course, we know that's where the White House sits. So this is, of course, now as you can see, we have banners that suggest the need for communism for the people to understand that communism does destroy humanity in the world. And like Mr. Browdy said, recently, given the past year and a half, the CCP pandemic has really awakened a lot of people to what the Communist Party has been doing to Falun Gong practitioners, but not limited to that, as we've heard, to Uyghurs, to Tibetans, to house Christians in China. And it's also been exporting its censorship, it's been exporting its persecution methods to every other country that has to employ those. Of course, given the recent protest in Cuba, the Communist Party regime in Cuba has also employed many of these censorship tactics, such as internet being shut down and all that. So what I think we should touch on more is actually the censorship aspect of this, which is that from the very beginning, there's been a state machine at work to prevent truth and prevent information from getting out, or even to just be shown to its own people, right?
Yeah, there has been, and it's I mean, we talk about fake news here, it's nothing compared to China. We often call China the kingdom of fake news. I mean, because that's all there is. It's fabricated state-run media 24/7. And as you can imagine, when they first started persecuting Falun Gong, that was a cornerstone of the persecution. Churning out lie after lie after lie about what Falun Gong is and isn't, and all kinds of things. And Falun Gong really has been a pioneer in trying to peacefully combat that. In one case, early in the 2000s, they were actually taught themselves how to tap into the state-run broadcasts and broadcast information that's freely available in the free world about what Falun Gong really is and about all the atrocities that they were facing, and it sent shockwaves through the country. Falun Gong outside of China have been the pioneers on software that lets you navigate around the Great Firewall. And, you know, as I just mentioned earlier, they are also the ones who have been, in many ways, leading the way to sound the alarm about the CCP and the dangers it poses to all of us. So it has been an enormous effort to counter the single biggest censorship regime in the world.
So we've recently got the chance to sit down with a China expert, author of many books on exposing Marxism, on exposing communism, on exposing some of the aspects of socialism that are very apparent in society for the worse. His name is Trevor Loudon, and we recently got to sit down with him to talk about why this concept of religion or concept of faith is so crucial for the CCP to destroy in their process. And the Falun Gong practitioners has only shown us that any sort of beliefs, not just religious like Buddhism, Taoism, or even Christianity, is a threat to communism, but more importantly, anything that doesn't rhyme with the CCP is under threat. And so we know that, in China, there hasn't really been one group that hasn't been on the receiving end of the multiple kinds of persecution again by the Communist Party. So we'll have that video for you now.
Well, communism is power, and they want a complete monopoly on power. Religion is something that people look to outside of the state. They regard it as something more important than the state, that's higher, their highest aspiration. So the state wants under communism, the state wants a complete monopoly on your thoughts, your loyalties, your actions. So religion is competition, and religion is a superior competition. So they have to destroy it or co-opt it, one or the other. The state versus God must come well before the state. And this was the beauty of the American Revolution. It was the first country in world history that said man's rights come from God, not from the government. And that liberated America. That set people free to practice their religion, to build businesses, to build a great culture, to build a great society. But the totalitarians, the communists, have fought back against that for many, many years now. They aim to be the grantor of all rights. All rights must come from the state. So therefore, anybody who believes that their rights come from God is directly flying in the face of communist state power. So if you're a genuine religious believer that you have a higher calling than serving the state, that your real calling is to serve God, you are direct opposition to the communist state from that point. You may be an atheist, you may be an agnostic, you may love freedom, but you need to understand that this is ultimately, religion is the foundation of our society. Whether you like that or accept that or not, it is religion that has given us liberty, because religion is accepted by millions and millions of people, and they are the people who believe God is more important than government. So if you believe in liberty, if you believe in freedom, even if you are an atheist or an agnostic, you need to support your religious friends, because they are your greatest allies in battling this horrible, atheistic, monolithic, tyrannical system we call communism.
All right, welcome back. If you're just joining us now, this is the parade for the 2021 rally to end the persecution of Falun Gong, happening in Washington, D.C. live. And persecution of Falun Gong has been happening since 1999. On July 20th, it marked the beginning of the persecution and the crackdown. And so the people we're seeing on screen right now, they're holding different banners. For example, the one working towards us is Return to Tradition. That's how the way humanity would have a path forward. And also, to improve mortality, we need to return to the true aspects of virtue. So these people, they've, one of the speakers, I think it was Aaron, who talked about this this movement called Quit the CCP, or in Chinese it's 退党. And could you give us a short introduction as to how that sort of relates to Falun Gong?
Sure. I mean, in the early days of the persecution, this media was so bad that people all around China would try and tell others what was really happening to Falun Gong, and they just wouldn't listen. They're just so brainwashed. So the CCP is great. I mean, they just, in their head, they just regurgitated everything they've been taught since they were very small. And the CCP is great. They never make any mistakes. And so many of the volunteers, or many sort of the activists inside China, realized we need to disclose to these people the real history of the CCP before they're going to listen to anything that's real. And so they started distributing the 9 commentaries, which is a groundbreaking publication that documented in detail exactly what the CCP has done since it came to power. And over this network that Falun Gong activists operate, which is millions of people inside China, they distributed this all over. And then what came out of that is this desire of the Chinese people to quit the party, to distance themselves from the ruling Chinese regime. And at first it was, it was just a few people, but now, I mean, it swelled to hundreds of millions of people. I mean, think about that, have either quit the CCP or disavowed their relations with other CCP organizations. So it's become a huge movement inside China.
That's great to hear. And so just a little bit of background. The Chinese Communist Party has 3 branches. So it has the Communist Party itself, which by getting a membership, you get a lot of access to different, I wouldn't say higher class, but a lot of perks that goes along with it. And a little bit younger than that, for those that are still in college, are belonging to the Youth League, which is of sort of this preparatory membership towards the Communist Party. And then before that, even as young as kindergarten, you're encouraged to join the Young Pioneer, which is a youth group that's, like we just mentioned, very young age Chinese students in school are told to essentially be worshipping the party at a very young age, to be able to install that message into their brain in a very young age. And so let's just briefly turn to that topic a little bit. With the quitting the CCP, as we can see now, we have a lot of the white banners here that says stop the persecution against Falun Gong in China. So far, what is the way for people to, is this sort of a Chinese only thing, or is this, how do we quit the CCP?
Well, inside China, there are again millions of people that are talking to Chinese people and disclosing the true history of the CCP, and they actually have a website and an actual mechanism where people can actually either use their real, or if it would be a security concern, they can use an alias, but an act for them to take, because most of these people took a very dramatic act when they joined the CCP, pledging before the flag and everything. And so that's very important for them, lethargic, sort of to get past that mentally. But it's actually all over the world. These Tuidong centers, these Quit CCP centers, are actually all over the world, and Chinese tourists and other people that have joined the Communist Party, it's a way to sort of take that and make a clean break from something that's clearly very evil and has clearly caused an enormous amount of human suffering.
Wow, and we just saw something called Arrest Zhang, or Bring Zhang to Justice. Could you tell us exactly who is Zhang, or what is Zhang?
So Zhang Ziman is the former leader of the Chinese Communist Party. He was the man I mentioned earlier who was single-handedly, essentially, ordered that this persecution occur. He had come to power in the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which he supported, and that was one of the reasons he was catapulted to the top position. And so in 1999, he was the one who was trying to build up a cult of personality around himself, felt he couldn't do it, and decided to persecute Falun Gong as a power grab, as a way to consolidate his power. So he's really the architect of the persecution and the main person behind it.
Interesting. And as we're seeing now is still the march toward 15th Street and Constitution Avenue, stopping right in front of the Washington Monument. It seems like the parade has about a few thousand people participating today. It seems few groups one after the other. And so far we've been talking a lot about what is the persecution about on Falun Gong, and also what is the organ harvesting. But right now I would like to play you a video to introduce a little bit as a refresher of the background of what Falun Gong is, and to get a better understanding, and then we'll have Levi here introduce Falun Gong a little bit more for us.
Falun Dafa Introduction. This is Falun Dafa, also known as Falun Gong. It's a spiritual practice based on a tradition that dates back more than 1,000 years. It was once passed down only from teacher to disciple. In 1992, Mr. Li Hongzhi made Falun Gong public and began teaching it across China. Falun Gong is a type of Qigong, a class of gentle exercises and meditation designed to improve mind and body. Other Qigong systems, like Tai Chi, are also popular in China. But unlike most Qigong taught in China today, Falun Gong emphasizes spiritual improvement. Its core principles are truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, or Zhen Shan Ren in Chinese. Falun Gong practitioners study its teachings through published texts, especially the book Zhuan Falun. They aim to elevate their moral standards while supplementing their practice with 5 sets of physical exercises. 9-day Falun Gong workshops are offered in cities around the world. The workshops introduce the main text and teach the exercises. Falun Gong workshops are always free of charge. Since its introduction 29 years ago, Falun Gong has spread to tens of millions of people in over 100 countries and regions.
All right, welcome back. Now, we just saw a video of the introduction of Falun Gong. And as Levi mentioned earlier, the moral teachings of Falun Gong is written in a book called Zhuan Falun. And this book has been published and translated to over 30 languages worldwide. So now we have an introductory video for you to play to watch for what the book Zhuan Falun is all about.
Zhuan Falun, a chronology. Zhuan Falun is the main text of the Chinese spiritual practice Falun Gong. Its 9 chapters are based on Falun Gong founder Mr. Li Hongzhi's 9-day lecture seminars that were popular in China. The book is centered around Falun Gong's core principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. Zhuan Falun was first published in December 1994 by a Chinese state-run publishing house. In early 1996, Zhuan Falun was a bestseller in Beijing. Zhuan Falun was eventually banned in China after the Chinese Communist Party feared it had become more popular than party ideology. To meet public demand, the book was widely pirated and distributed by underground booksellers. From 2008 to 2009, thousands of Falun Gong practitioners from around the world gathered in Taiwan and formed the cover of the Zhuan Falun to express their gratitude to Mr. Li Hongzhi for bringing Zhuan Falun to millions of people worldwide. Zhuan Falun has been translated into 47 languages, making it the most widely translated Chinese book of all time. Zhuan Falun is available for free online at falundafa.org.
Welcome back. Levi, could you give us a brief, connection between Falun Gong and the book? And so where did that book actually sort of start? Was it introduced right away to the practitioners? And what kind of a role does the book play?
Yeah, it's an interesting story how Falun Gong got started because, we talk about 100 million people. It must have been like advertisements and a big thing. It actually started in a tiny little simple schoolhouse in a northeastern town called Changchun, China. And there was no materials at all. In fact, I saw sketches where Mr. Li had just sort of sketched out with stick figures. People were asking how to do the exercises, and he sort of sketched it out on a piece of paper, and he taught them in the schoolhouse. And really, people would, as we mentioned before, experience these health benefits, experience a calming of their spirit, and they start telling their friends and neighbors and everybody and that's how it grew. And so for the first couple of years, it really started from that. Now, during those first 2 years, 92 to 90, latter parts of 94, Mr. Li was invited by various organizations, sometimes even the government, to travel around China, and he gave lectures. So that's what it was in those first 2 years. It was giving lectures, people learning the practice from those lectures, telling their friends and family. The book itself was not actually published until those lectures were finished. And it very quickly became a bestseller around China because it really encapsulates the entirety of the teachings of Falun Gong.
Great. So now we'll return to the live shots here, and it shows, once again, many banners that suggest help these practitioners, and also as well as communism is destroying humanity. So Levi just mentioned the author of the book, Zhuan Falun, is Master Li. Now we have a video for you here to introduce the master of Falun Gong and what he does, where he comes from. Okay, so we actually don't have that one. So now, can you briefly give us an introduction to Master Li?
Well, he He doesn't talk a whole lot about himself. I mean, the main story, he was born in Changchun, China, which is where he introduced the Falun Gong. He grew up in China, and he learned various practices from several different masters and lineages, from different lineages. And Falun Gong itself actually has a very long lineage going back thousands of years, but it wasn't one of the practices that's been made public. So the primary thing that Mr. Li did is, after learning from these various masters and fine-tuning, perfecting the practice himself, in '92 he decided to make it public, and he did something interesting there. He made it completely open, free for the public. Today, if you want to read Zhuang Falun, or if you want to learn the exercises, there's a website where you can just download the book for free, or you can watch the videos for free. And that was a key principle that he talked about a lot, is he wanted people to be able to just, if they want to practice, they shouldn't have to pay a penny. They should just be able to come and learn. And that was, I think, that was one of the things that really struck me when I first came in contact with Falun Gong.
Right. And so my question becomes, how did this sort of, for lack of a better term, a free exercise or practice actually becomes this, what the Communist Party's propaganda often calls as this political machine of sort? How did that sort of evolve from a practice to a political side of things?
It's real simple. The CCP needed to make up some lies to justify what they were going to do to Falun Gong. I mean, it really comes down to that. Now, how did they do that? It took some time. Because again, by the late 1990s, a lot of Chinese people knew of Falun Gong. They're very familiar. Everybody had at least a friend or a family member practicing. And so it took a few years, actually, of just nonstop propaganda to try and turn the Chinese people's minds against Falun Gong. How did they do that? Well, they just come up with the points that will resonate the most. And one of the points is what you just mentioned. If they can convince people that Falun Gong has like a foreign influence and they're there to topple China, that resonates with the Chinese people. Keep in mind, the Chinese people, for millennia, China was the center of the world, way ahead of everybody in terms of innovation, political, religious plurality. I mean, it was the leader of the world, but they'd just been through 100 years of very difficult times. And so to tell the Chinese people someone's against China, that'll really work. So that, along other lies, are the things they crafted to get people to dislike Falun Gong.
So was it they just somehow made it seem like a United States government process was involved in this process, or how did that sort of foreign influence aspect come to be?
Well, they have this term they use called anti-China forces, which is, in my opinion, intentionally vague. But yeah, well, they'll spread lies that Falun Gong has the CIA behind them, or the government behind them, or this or that. Again, trying to hone in on that fear of the Chinese people, who have just been through 100 years of very difficult times, that this is a force trying to keep China down and keep the Chinese people down.
Right. So now we actually have a video with an interview from Congressman Glenn Grothman, who told us recently on what communism aims to achieve and how we can resist it here in the United States. And so Congressman Glenn Grothman talked a lot about what is the impact of communism happening in the United States today.
In China, their leaders are communist Marxists, and of course we have Marxists now in the United States as well. I think, like all Marxists, they want everybody just worshiping or following the government and finding an alternative thing to follow, be it Falun Gong or Christianity or Islam or whatever, is something that scares the government. We see the same kind of anti-religious feeling among Marxist groups in the United States, but obviously it's come full flower in Red China, and I think it's important to send a message to Red China that the reason there is tension between our countries is not even primarily economic or military. It's because such a different value set, in that they feel that they can shut down religion. And of course, doing it in such a horrible way at the Falun Gong. We talk about even harvesting organs, that sort of thing, which would be unheard of in our country. But in a country without any religion, without any belief in a higher power, this is what the Communist Party does. I think it's something we have to look out for. As you see lesser and lesser Americans going to
is help to stop the persecution of Falun Gong in China. And that's really, I think, today's big message for anybody watching in DC or over our live streams, is that this persecution has been happening and is still happening. And as many of the speakers actually mentioned, the persecution needs to be stopped. And Levi, return to you here. The persecution that's been carried out against Falun Gong practitioners, and you mentioned a lot of it has been transported to or exported to other countries. How do you see that this persecution, what's the best way for us to see it to end?
Well, I think there's the concrete stuff that such we mentioned the Department of State doing sanctions. Direct action against direct individuals who are personally responsible for this persecution in China is one of the biggest impacts we've seen. Again, what we saw in China, people being released, people sort of covering their tracks. That's something that I think we really need to stay focused on. But we can't underestimate publicly speaking out. And in order to publicly speak out, really we need a lot more education on this issue. What people don't realize is the Falun Gong issue has dominated internal CCP politics for a quarter of a century. It has shaped the Chinese Communist Party. One of the speakers actually mentioned something I think was very important, is that those who persecute Falun Gong over the last 20 years, they get promoted in the CCP system, and those who don't are let go. What does that do for an organization? What does that do to weaponize the CCP against the rest of us? And so when the Americans, American businesses, American politicians, and other people around the world, when they're clear on that, then we know we're not going to get manipulated, and we have the ability to take action and stop the CCP from doing all the horrible stuff it's been doing in our country and around the world.
So I would like to get back to a point we will be making soon. For right now, if you're just joining us, we are covering the parade for the 2021 End Persecution of Falun Gong in Washington, D.C. And what we're seeing on screen right now are thousands of practitioners of Falun Gong who are holding up banners, messages of different kinds. So far, the one on screen is humanity's only hope is to improve morality. Now, returning to our question, and you just mentioned that the persecution allows individuals inside the party to advance their ranking. What is the system that allows them to do that? Is there like an organization that allows them to achieve this, or what the party does?
Yeah, that's a really good point. When Zhang Ziman first ordered this persecution, there was two kind of things happening. One, he was doing this kind of elevation himself. I remember back in the early days, there was a point in time where he elevated more military generals in that time window than any previous leader had, and he did so solely on this criteria. Were they willing to persecute Falun Gong or not? So it's just, across the military, across the government, people, if they're willing to persecute Falun Gong, they're going to advance themselves. But he also had a problem, and that is, as we mentioned, at the end of the 1990s, a lot of people knew Falun Gong, so how was he going to get the rank and file across the country to persecute these people when a lot of them knew they're good people? He created what is now known as the Chinese Gestapo. It's the 610 office, and it operates completely outside the law, and it reported directly to the Politburo, Zhang Ziman specifically. And the reason he did that is now he had a security agency that he could operate directly with, and that had oversight over all the police, all the security agencies around the country. He used this 610 office as one of the primary weapons to actually do the dirty work, to pull people out of their homes and throw them into prison, to torture them, to refine torture, to do the propaganda. It all came down to this 610 office, and Zhang Ziman created that office in 1999.
So does that jurisdiction or this organization, does it abide by Chinese laws, or how does this, what's the lawful process if we have any that?
Well, the short answer is no. And that was the whole point, is that he wanted a security agency he can control completely outside the law. And one of the things that was characteristic of this organization is a lot of the orders would not be done over official documents or things like that. There were a lot were given out orally, or the mandates were marked top secret. And so that alone tells you something very shifty is going on. But to answer your question, yeah, it was completely outside the law.
No, it seems everybody these days want a secret police force working for them. And so really, today's message is about restoring humanity's morals. And it seems what the CCP has been doing all these years is the opposite of that. Is they're trying to demoralize or dehumanize the population. And so for me personally, what I've seen so far is covering China news. A lot of the news we're seeing from China today they seem unbelievable to Western audience or to the people in the United States that something tragic or any sort of violence could occur in China, because they sort of put up this this face or this mask of Chinese glory or this communism glory that has advanced society so much. You know, in Shanghai, you see the beautiful skylines. In Hong Kong, you have all this beautiful, financial systems and all that. In Beijing, you have the Communist Party's headquarters. What do you think is? Can you speak on the misinformation or the disinformation that the party has been putting out since the persecution to make this image of Great China?
Yeah, I mean it's such a two different realities, because you're right, they do put, and then, the 2008 Olympics were sort of a part of that, is that showcasing the world how great they are. But you said something I think was really important early on for people to understand, is that they are tearing apart the very fabric of society. I mean, imagine 100 million people, not only persecuting those people, but now their family members, their coworkers have to openly declare a separation from that person. That literally tears apart families. It literally tears apart friendships. I was just in a panel 2 days ago down in DC, and a young man who used to be a PhD student at Tsinghua University, which is basically China's MIT, told the story that when he was persecuted Falun Gong, his classmates, good buddies, people that he was really close to, had to stand up and condemn him in front of class and start hating him. That's like a microcosm of what the entire society, the convulsions that the entire society has gone through. It's very hard to overstate the impact on people's morals and how they treat each other, and just how society can function when you've got that many people that are forced to be ostracized against. It's horrific.
So that is why the message during the parade is also to stop the persecution, not just to the Falun Gong practitioners, but as we've seen so far, it seems a majority of the Chinese people today are also being persecuted against to some degrees, in that the government, the regime is not allowing them to have friends or family, it seems. And is this, have you seen in your studies over the years, is this the typical way for the Chinese regime to actually attack anybody that's against them, or is this something specifically created or even advanced because of the persecution of Falun Gong?
I think it's a little of both. I mean, certainly the CCP throughout its history has a pattern of every 8 or 10 years going after a group. And the reason for that is if they go after a group and try to eliminate or terrorize that group, everyone else sees very clearly what could happen to them, and it petrifies the whole populace. They did this all the way back, dating into the early 1950s, with some of the campaigns there through the Cultural Revolution, the Tiananmen Square Massacre. I had a close friend here who I remember having a conversation with her when she first came over in the 90s, and she saw the news about the Tiananmen Square Massacre, and she said, "What are you talking about? That was a violent riot by students that our army benevolently put down and restored order." That's what she really thinks. And these are not uneducated people. These are the most educated of the Chinese coming over to our universities. So that stuff has been going on all along, and they've taken that model, persecuting one group to terrorize everybody else. Falun Gong is the latest example of that.
That's very interesting. Now, once again, with our live scenes, we've seen that many of the banners, actually, there's different messages. One of them right now that's passing through is the 3 core tenets of practicing Falun Gong, which is truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. And these values seems to be, despite being universal, they're very much under attack today, especially in China. And the one that's approaching us is the Global Tweedown Center, which is this, once again, a global movement of Chinese people en masse quitting the party of the CCP, using their real name or using an alias to essentially be psychologically or mentally separated from this party that does harm to people. But also, many people are waking to the idea that the regime is, throughout its years, as Levi just mentioned, unable to stop persecuting somebody with every 8 to 10 years. And we've actually going to return to the topic of forced organ harvesting, as some of the banners have been showing us here too, is that this crime against humanity has been happening since 2006, around that time. And David Matus and David Kilgore, who are two Canadian human rights lawyers, but also David Kilgore was a MP in Canada. They released an investigation, an independent investigation that actually covered a lot of the forced organ harvesting topics that we will discuss. And Levi, do you have a sort of a summary for us, maybe, as to what did that report entail?
Well, what they did is, it's very hard to investigate any crime like this in China. It's not like China's going to open the doors to their hospitals and labor camps and let you in, and if they do, you can better believe it's all going to be staged. So how do you dig out the details? David Kilgore and David Mattis were really leading the charge on pulling out evidence that they could. For example, they worked with undercover investigators that would call these hospitals that were openly advertising that you can get a heart or a liver in just like 2 weeks, something that's absolutely impossible unless you have a whole collection of live people ready to be killed. So they worked with these undercover investigators to call these hospitals, and these doctors and these hospital administrators are openly admitting on the phone, yes, you can get an organ, a vital organ, in a week or two. Yes, they're from Falun Gong, because those Falun Gong people are really healthy. Just come on over, we'll get you an organ. There is no way this is at all possible unless they're holding Falun Gong, pre-screened, ready to kill them. And so David Kilgore and David Mattis were really pulled this kind of evidence together and released it to the world that says we've got a terrible form of evil in China.
So we have a video from another congressman. His name is Steve Stockman, and his message to stop the forced organ harvesting in China today against Falun Gong practitioners, against Uyghur Muslims, against House Christians, against Tibetans in China. And so we'll have this video for you to play now.
July 20th is coming up. That's the 22nd year anniversary of the persecution of Falun Gong. When you were in Congress, you were very outspoken about this issue. Why is that?
Well, I don't like people getting persecuted. Anybody's persecution's bad, and what they've done to them is horrible, horrible. Harvesting organs, doing the persecutions. I fought also for the Christians that are being persecuted. There's a whole host of Uyghurs, the Falun Gong, and people need to have a heart. And not talking about what happened 150 years ago. There's more people in prison and slaves right now in China than there was ever in America. Yet China's got us talking about what happened 150 years ago. We're playing into their hands. They want to divide us as a nation. They want to divide us as a people so they can take it. In 2005, there's a great book written about Mao. He says he thrived on revolution by chaos. This defunding the police, this anarchy is exactly Maoism from a great book in 2005 which describes what went on. And also another book is the book was, I believe, written in 1988. It's called Unrestricted Warfare. And they're doing exactly what was laid out in the book, including letting loose viruses and stuff. This is not by accident. It is horrible what's going on. And our country is under assault right now, as much as it was under 9/11, only more so. This is orchestrated. China needs to turn away from Marxism and communism. It's a Western philosophy. It destroys and kills people. And they need to learn about the Cultural Revolution, and also learn about Tiananmen Square, educate yourself. And people don't realize most of the Chinese that are here educated are really tied to the leaders of China. You have an opportunity to go to universities. You know, the Confucius institutes are on campus to control the students. You can go to the campus and start handing out literature on what happened to the Falun Gong's organ harvesting. You can hand the campus, you can go there and also talk to them about Tiananmen Square, educate them. They're not, we had two in our office. They didn't believe, they said it was America propaganda that there was a Tiananmen Square. They said, the Chinese said it was absolute lie.
Welcome back. According to the Falun Dafa Information Center and Minghui.org, over 4,500 practitioners have died as a direct result of the CCP's persecution since 1999. It is feared that the actual number of deaths from torture, malnutrition, exhaustion, and neglect in detention, and especially from organ harvesting in hospitals, however, already may many be times higher than what we know. No, we also have another video here for you. Is from Congressman Brian Babin, who also spoke on what he believes is with forced organ harvesting, a crime that's being committed in China right at this moment. So we'll have the video from Congressman Brian Babin for you here.
There should be sanctions, and I personally believe that the evidence is there that we are having forced organ harvesting at the hands of the Communist Party of China. And the poor folks, the believers in Falun Gong are some of the worst victims of this crime. They also, there's evidence there that they've used not only this, but in their criminal prisons, they have for long periods of time have executed people and immediately harvested their organs. There's even evidence now, Steve, that people are having their organs harvested before they die. This is what's happening. It is worse than the Nazi Germans and some of those experiments under Dr. Mengele back in the 40s. We have to get to the bottom of that. This is an evil regime.
So, Levi, with the organ harvesting, can you give us an introduction or a summary as to who's at play? Is it hospitals, police system, prisons? How does that connect?
Well, one of the shocking things that David Mattis and David Kilgore uncovered, and Ethan Gutman was actually instrumental in this as well, is that it was really the military running it in conjunction with hospitals, which is sort of shocking because, first of all, the fact that doctors at this scale would engage in this kind of atrocity was a big shocker. But the fact that the military was actually running it, because the military would have the best sense of these, I guess the only way to call them is concentration camps. It's these large areas where Falun Gong had gone. A lot of people don't know where they are, and they served as sources for organ banks, essentially, for these hospitals. So it was really the army, or the military rather, and hospitals around the country.
So as our parade continues, we are seeing banners of asking, the world needs Falun Gong, the world needs truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance. And also behind that, the white banner is of quitting the CCP. And I believe one of the areas that we haven't really touched on, but it's very important, is that seems like Falun Gong news or news regarding the persecution seems to be very minimal, or it's not exposed as much as maybe the Uyghur Muslims or even the Tibetan persecution. What do you think is the reason for that to be the case?
That is an excellent question. I think there's a couple points before we address that directly that I'd like to sort of lay the groundwork for your viewers, and that is, in the first 2 years of the persecution, there was real high-quality reporting. In fact, the Wall Street Journal won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting precisely because they exposed that Falun Gong were being tortured and killed around China. The Washington Post itself put out some groundbreaking work where they disclosed that actually this is a top-down mandated thing to use torture and brainwashing on Falun Gong practitioners. So that first year or two, there was a lot of good quality reporting. Then silence, for the most part. Why was that happening? Well, one thing to look at the evidence. Was it because things were not happening anymore? If you look at the major human rights groups, Freedom House, Amnesty International, or our own Department of State religious freedom reports, year after year after year, from 1999 all the way up to this year, they're consistently documenting that this indeed is happening. So that's not the reason. The evidence is there. So why are media not nearly covering this, at least at the scale to meet the gravity of the crime? I think there's three reasons. One, the CCP has been enormously effective in propaganda here in the West. They, at the very highest levels, have tried to convince our leaders, our businesses, that we're weird, we're strange, don't cover the Falun Gong issue. Zhang Ziman, the former leader of the CCP, even brought this up directly to President Bill Clinton during the APEC meeting in 1999. When Condoleezza Rice took over as National Security Advisor in 2001, the first thing on the agenda for Chinese diplomats was a pre-written 30-minute speech disparaging Falun Gong. She finally had to kick him out of her office because she was there to talk about real issues. So at the very highest level, across all sort of these sectors, the Chinese government has been putting out propaganda here in the West, and that has had an impact. The other thing we can't ignore is the increasing financial interconnectivity between businesses, particularly media businesses in the West, and China. If you look, all of our big media companies, whether paper or TV companies, they all have ownership that has millions and millions of dollars of deals inside China. Does that have an influence? all we can say for sure, it represents a clear conflict of interest to have that much financial incentive in China and to accurately report about the abuses that the CCP is meting out against Falun Gong. Because keep in mind, the CCP views Falun Gong as the single greatest threat. So if they have one request to not cover something, it's going to be Falun Gong. So there's a conflict of interest there, I think, is also at play.
Very interesting. And this concludes our live coverage of the 2021 rally to end the persecution of Falun Gong in Washington, D.C. I want to thank our guest, Mr. Levi Browdy, again for all your great insights and also the information from the perspective of the group of Falun Gong. And what we hope so far is, as we approach July 20th, 2021, it marks the 22nd anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party's persecution against Falun Gong practitioners. And so was there any sort of a last message that you want to get across to our audience before we conclude here today?
I think the message is the CCP is very dangerous to us Americans and to the world, and we cannot understand that threat, and therefore we cannot meet that threat without understanding the Falun Gong issue, and that's why this story is so important.
I think it's time for all of us to start to get to know the story there. Now, once again, thank you so much for watching today. I'm David Zhang, and have a great day.